She says that P47 means present plus 47,000 years, and P52 means present plus 52,000 years. And I find this very interesting because that idea that aliens are us from the future has been around for quite a while, especially in media. I can think of a couple of examples, one being in Interstellar. If you've seen that movie, that kind of implies that these beings they were interacting with and getting messages from were actually just themselves in a different time. And also the TV show Fringe, which is one of my favourite shows of all time. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend. But they also show humans coming back from the future that are highly technologically advanced. And if we didn't know any better, we might call them aliens, but they were just humans, really advanced humans. So that's something I've always wondered when I hear about UFO stories and alien encounters and all of this. I wonder, is it just us from the future or another timeline? But anyway, back to Amy. She mentioned that she felt like there were possibly people monitoring her before her death, saying that one day she came home and there was a micro USB charger plugged into the wall that had been cut in half with a knife, leaving the wire exposed. So half of it was in the wall and the other half was laying on the kitchen counter, which she claimed hadn't been that way before she left her home. During a presentation that she gave about propulsion systems, someone in the audience asked her, "What about the innovator who's afraid of disappearing?" To which Amy responded, "That's a whole other problem. I think doing it in the public is better in that case." Basically meaning if you're as public as possible, you're less likely to be disappeared. And perhaps the most chilling part of this particular case is that prior to her death, she had sent friends a message saying, "If you see any report that I killed myself, I most definitely did not. If you see any report that I overdosed, I most definitely did not. If you see any report saying that I killed anyone else, I most definitely did not." Then she passed away and it was cited as being self-inflicted, even though she had said this days earlier to her friends. So that's the first interesting one. The next one is on July 30th, 2023. A scientist named David Hicks passed away, and his cause of death was never made public, and there doesn't appear to be any public record of an autopsy having been performed. And he was 59 years old at the time of his death. He worked at JPL, which stands for Jet Propulsion Laboratory, as a NASA postdoc, and then as a research scientist from 1998 until 2022. So again, within propulsion fields. He had earned degrees from Boston University and a PhD in lunar and planetary science at the University of Arizona. His research for making outstanding individual contributions in his field. So he was a big deal. And NASA has never commented publicly on his death, and the only public record about his passing was an obituary that was posted online. So, yet another mysterious death we know nothing about, and he worked in propulsion systems just like the others so far. So, very weird. The next person we're going to be talking about is 78-year-old Anthony Chavez, who worked at Los Alamos National Laboratory until he retired in 2017. He was last seen on May 24th, 2025, leaving his home on 37th Street in Los Alamos on foot. He was described as very fit and slender, healthy and clear-headed. Despite being 78, he was in very good health. A friend of his said, quote, "He is active and intellectually engaged. It is very much out of character or circumstance for him to be out of touch with his family or friends for more than a day. He is my best friend and we were in contact regularly. His car was locked and parked in his driveway. His wallet, car keys and personal items were left inside his home. So it appears that he left his home with the intention of not being gone for more than a few minutes. He did hike in Pueblo Canyon often, but it does not appear that he left home prepared for a hike. Plus, the weather was very inclement, and he does not carry a cell phone." When authorities searched his home, they did indeed find Anthony's wallet, keys and cigarettes on the living room table, and there was no sign of forced entry, and cadaver dogs didn't find anything suspicious inside the home. The lead investigator on Anthony's case said that there was no evidence of a scuffle. There was no blood. There was nothing. It was just like he left. And that's it. He's never been seen again. He just walks out of his house and completely disappears. I mean, I know he's 78, but his friends all seem to think that he was very sharp still. So, very, very odd. So, the next scientist that went missing mysteriously was Monica Razor. She spent 37 years working for a rocket engine company that was funded by NASA and the Air Force, and later became the director of materials processing at NASA itself. She co-invented something called Mondaloy, which was a nickel-based super alloy that was able to withstand high-pressure, oxygen-rich environments without bursting into flames. Because up until this point, Americans were having to rely on Russian-made materials for any space launches, because Russia had already created this type of metal that could withstand the pressure that was needed whilst also remaining tough. And that's not something the Americans had figured out yet. Until Monica Razor and some of her colleagues produced Mondaloy. This was then used in advanced rocket engines, including ones in classified space projects that were going on at the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. On June 22nd, 2025, at 9:10 a.m, Monica is 60 years old at this point, and she's out hiking with a couple of friends on the Mount Waterman Trail in the Angeles National Forest. The friends that she was with said that she lagged behind a little bit, but they could still clearly see her. She was only about 30 foot behind them, so they would turn back every minute or two to check on her and wave at her and say hello. So they were constantly able to see her. And then one time they turned around to check on her, which had only been a couple of minutes since the time before. She was nowhere to be seen. and started searching for Monica using helicopters, dogs. They also had volunteers, and the search went on for 8 days, where they found no trace of Monica except her red beanie hat, which was found 600 foot down inside a ravine. Photographs from that day show that this hat was tucked into her hip belt. She was well equipped for a hike with all the appropriate gear required, and she wasn't a stranger to hiking. This was something she'd done many times, and yet she just disappeared, never to be found. Authorities continued their search for 6 months and still came up empty-handed. It's just so strange that she wasn't that far from her friends, and they heard nothing. Like, if she was to have been attacked by, say, a mountain lion or some kind of animal, or she fell, she would very likely make a noise. You're not going down silently, are you? Especially if you're getting hurt either by an animal or a fall. But they heard nothing and never saw her again. I mean, how frustrating. I can't imagine having someone so close to you, as in not just a friend, but physically close to you. You can see them, they're within your line of sight, within earshot, and they completely disappear. Crazy. And then this next person went missing just 4 days after Monica. Jesse then tries to call Melissa multiple times but was unable to get through to her. He then messaged his daughter Sierra at around 1:30 asking if she had been in contact with her mum that day, and she said yes, I saw her at lunchtime. So he said, okay, could you text her and ask if she's going to pick me up from work or if I need to get a ride back. So Sierra took a screenshot of her dad asking this and sent it to her mum, which showed that her mum had read the message but she never responded. But she just kind of assumed that her mum would immediately call her dad. But she did not. The last known sighting of Melissa Casillas was approximately 2:18 p.m. A family acquaintance saw Melissa walking eastward on the NM 518 from Talpa, New Mexico, towards Pot Creek, which was about 3 miles from their home. She was captured walking along this road on security camera from a local business, which was Kit Carson Electric Company. She was described as wearing a light-coloured t-shirt, jeans, and light-coloured tennis shoes. Now, Melissa's family suspected that she may have got into a vehicle not long after she was seen on this video, because there was a blue truck that was captured driving past her, and then as it goes past her, she's never seen again. And what's also interesting is that I believe this vehicle was tracked down and searched, and there was a badge for the lab that she worked at inside of it. But authorities claim that this did not belong to Melissa Casillas. Okay, anyway, Sierra left work at 3:30 earlier than normal because she was worried, and when she got home the door was locked, so clearly her mum wasn't working from home as she said she would be. But her car was parked on the driveway. When she got inside, she immediately saw that her mum's keys and work phone were sat on the kitchen table. Sierra did a quick search of the house and found her mum's personal phone in her office along with her purse and her wallet. So all personal items left at home again. But what's even weirder is that both her work phone and her personal phone had been factory reset. So when Sierra tried to check them for any information, like any calls that might be odd, any messages, there was nothing to be found because they'd just been completely wiped clean. Sierra also found the cheque that she'd given her mum to take to the bank at the house, and so she didn't even go to the bank after seeing her daughter. Mark and Sierra are obviously devastated, and they can't make any sense of her disappearance. There were no implications that Melissa was unhappy in her marriage or in her family and wanted to leave. They even had a trip planned for the next day to go and stay at a lake house, and Melissa seemed to be looking forward to it. Sierra said that her and her mum had a very close relationship, and she felt like if her mum was that unhappy and planning to leave, that she would have confided in her in some way, or left her a note or something, rather than just completely disappearing without saying anything to her. So, what did Melissa do for work? Melissa herself actually wasn't a scientist, but she was an admin assistant at the Los Alamos National Laboratory. admin assistant, you see lots of paperwork. I'm sure she had to sort through lots of classified documents. So I think even an administration assistant would be privy to lots of information that scientists were. When Mark looked through Melissa's personal belongings, he found evidence that she was under a lot of stress that they weren't aware of, but it's unclear as to the type of stress, like whether it was financial or work related. They're not sure. But again, they were like, they don't think she was stressed enough to have unalived herself or purposefully disappeared without talking to them about it first. You know, like, even though she was hiding her stress, they do feel like she would have at some point come to them about it. But yeah, Melissa has never been seen again. She's just missing. The next person we're talking about is Joshua LeBlanc, who was a 29-year-old NASA Aerospace Technologies electrical engineer, and he died during a car crash on July 22nd, 2025 at 2:45 p.m. in Alabama whilst driving his Tesla. It's said that his vehicle collided with the guardrail and several trees before bursting into flames, and his body was so badly burned that it was beyond recognition, and it took 3 days to identify him. His family had reported him missing earlier in the day because he had uncharacteristically not showed up for work at NASA, where he was reported to have been working on nuclear propulsion projects that would enable faster and more robust transportation for crew and cargo missions to Mars and science missions to the outer solar system. They said it was unlike him to not show up for work and to not call in and give a reason as to why he's not coming. So Joshua's family feared that maybe he'd been abducted because they found his phone and wallet at home. I just can't believe how many of these are so similar. Personal belongings just left at home. Who these days even leaves the house without their phone? I know I don't. It's very unlikely that I will leave the house without my phone. When authorities looked through the data from his Tesla Sentry mode, it showed that his car had been sat at an airport in Huntsville for hours on the morning of his death, which the family said was completely out of character. He had no trips planned. He wasn't dropping anyone off. He wasn't picking anyone up. There was absolutely no need for Joshua to have been at an airport that day. And he just didn't turn up for work, so he was scheduled to go to work. You would think if he had any kind of plans where he had to maybe pick up a friend or something like that, he would let work know, hey, I'm going to be late this day because I've got to go and get a friend. But he never did that. He never disclosed any plans to anybody about needing to go to the airport, but his car showed that it was sat there for 4 hours, and then he has an accident so bad that they can't identify his body for 3 days. Very sad. This next man we're talking about is 48-year-old Stephen Garcia, and he was last seen leaving his Albuquerque, New Mexico home at 9 a.m. on August 28th, 2025, wearing green camo shorts and a t-shirt, and he left on foot, and the only thing he had with him was a handgun, and he was never seen again. He lived in a very rural area with minimal neighbours, but the neighbours he did have also worked in aerospace research. Authorities did warn that Garcia may be a danger to himself. However, an anonymous source disputed this, saying that he was a very stable person. possibility of Stephen being the target of foreign spies makes the most sense. Other sources say that Stephen Garcia was a government contractor working for the Kansas City National Security Campus, which plays a key role in America's national defense. Specifically, the campus manufactures more than 80% of all non-nuclear components that go into building military nuclear weapons. Stephen allegedly served as a property custodian at the New Mexico facility, which gave him top security clearance and broad access to the entire site's nuclear secrets. Former FBI Assistant Director Chris Swagger previously reported that our scientists have been targeted for a long time, especially in the rocket propulsion area, by hostile foreign intelligence services. And he was just never seen again. I mean, I suppose with that one you could say he left the house with a gun, he lived in a rural area, it's quite clear what happened. And maybe so, maybe that's one of the ones where it's a bit cut and dry, but it's still odd that he was just never seen again. You know, like, I don't know if they did a search for him either. I have no idea. Yet another disappearance is that of Jason Thomas, who was last seen on December 12th, 2025. Him and his wife had been on a night out with friends and were on the way home. His wife Kristen described him as being very quiet, but she said that was to be expected because he had recently lost both of his parents just a month prior. And this was his first social outing since it had happened. And whilst of course this was an awful tragedy for him and he was dealing with a tremendous amount of grief, his wife felt that they were battling through it together and dealing with it as best they could. And like all grief journeys, it's very up and down. She said that some days he would just be in tears all day, but then there were other days where he felt a bit more upbeat and was suggesting that they take their dogs on a hike, you know, and do something. But when they got home that night after spending it with friends, they took care of the dogs, you know, gave them water or treats outside before they went to bed. Kristen said that after she turned away for just a moment, she turned around and Jason was gone. She then heard a loud bang coming from the front of the house, which she recognised as the mailbox closing. So she ran outside to see if everything was okay, and she saw Jason walking outside the front. He looked at her and their eyes met, and she said that that gave her a sense of peace, like her worry diminished because they looked at each other and she felt like everything was fine and he was just going for a walk. And he left home at 11:53 p.m. and never returned. Kristen then woke up at 1:30 a.m. to Jason still not having come home, and that's when she realised that Jason had emptied his pockets from his jacket when he came upstairs earlier that night. She found his phone and his wallet on the bathroom counter. And shortly after this, she went outside to check the mailbox and found his Apple Watch inside. Kristen says she immediately began searching the home and their 2 cars in search of any clues as to where he went, but could find nothing. She then drove around the block, checking the routes that he would usually walk on, including a route around a nearby lake, but there was no sign of Jason. She then called the Wakefield Police Department, where she told them that this isn't like him, he would not come home, and that she thinks there's something very wrong. 4 on-duty officers began canvassing the area in their patrol cars and checked with local businesses for cameras or possible sightings. By 11 a.m. Jason not far from his home, where he crossed a street right near a train station, and that's where they focused their search. Both the drone and K9 teams followed the railroad tracks but found no sign of him. They had 2 other sets of K9 teams come in with both scent dogs and cadaver dogs, but nothing was found. Investigators don't believe that foul play was involved. Kristen says that she searched through Jason's journals looking for anything to make sense of why he would disappear, aside from the loss of his parents, and she said it seemed that Jason felt like he was under a lot of pressure. Kristen also said that he had mentioned to her about possibly changing careers, and his current job was an assistant director of chemical biology at Novartis. So maybe he was feeling a lot of pressure at work. But on Tuesday, March 17th, 2026, the Wakefield Police Department announced that a body had been recovered from Lake Quannapowitt. According to the report, the clothing suggested that the victim is Jason Thomas. But since this announcement, there's not been any more information as to whether this was confirmed to be him or not, so it's still unknown as to whether it was him. And I think this story is one that I could see being, it is what it is. Like, he was obviously struggling with the death of both of his parents. He was a single child, and maybe he just couldn't cope with that. So that one I'm not so sure is as suspicious, but I thought I'd mention it anyway. So the next person we're covering is Nuno Loureiro, and he was director of MIT's Plasma Science and Fusion Center. And he was known for research tied to fusion energy and astrophysical plasma dynamics. He had previously worked for the UK Atomic Energy Authority and as a researcher at the Plasma and Nuclear Fusion Institute in Portugal. So again, all to do with nuclear and propulsion systems. In January 2025, President Joe Biden presented Nuno with the Presidential Early Career Award, which is the highest US government honor for young scientists. So Nuno was a renowned scientist and a brilliant mind. But at just 48 years old, he was shot multiple times in the foyer of his Massachusetts apartment building and died. The only other person who saw his killer was his 12-year-old daughter, because she had actually answered the door for what she thought was a delivery man. Later, authorities reported that Claudio Manuel Neves Valente, a Portuguese national, who was the top suspect in a shooting that took place at Brown University just 2 days prior, was likely to also be Nuno's killer. And what's interesting is that Nuno and Claudio had actually both studied physics together 20 years ago at Portugal's Instituto Superior Técnico. And Claudio had his heart set on going to MIT for graduate school, but didn't get in despite being at the top of his class with another student. And Nuno wasn't at the top of his class. He was considered like an average student at the time that they were studying together. Claudio ended up attending Brown University instead and was reported as being quite egotistical and combative by his classmates. He also complained that the courses were too easy. So there's a theory that Claudio was resentful of Nuno's success, considering that he was just an average student at the time and Claudio was at the top of his class and didn't get into MIT. But that was 20 years ago, and they hadn't been in each other's lives since then. In fact, Claudio dropped out of Brown University and moved back to Portugal for a long time, where he worked 1st, Claudio rented a bluish-grey Nissan Sentra that had Florida number plates, and that car was seen repeatedly around Brown University between December 1st and December 12th. Then on Saturday, December 13th at 4 p.m, Claudio opened fire with a 9mm pistol into an open lecture hall in the Paris and Holly building of Brown University, which is the home of the physics department where students were taking final exams. He killed 2 students and injured 9 others. And Claudio actually made a confessional video that was found in his storage unit. He confessed that he had spent 6 semesters planning his attack at Brown University. And after the shooting, Claudio manages to evade police for 2 days. He was using a burner phone with a European SIM card, and he swapped out his credit cards and the license plate on his rental car. On Monday, December 15th, Providence police were still circulating surveillance clips from Brown and interviewing survivors in the hopes of locating Claudio. Then, that evening at 8:30, Nuno Loureiro was shot outside his home by a masked man. Now, what's interesting is that at 8:23, a camera records the suspect masked and wearing a vest over his darker clothing. However, Nuno's daughter describes the man as having short facial hair, which would suggest that he wasn't wearing a mask, that he was wearing a high-vis jacket with grey stripes over his clothes and a winter hat, and carrying a cardboard package, which is what made her think he was a delivery man. But the footage doesn't show any of those things. It doesn't show a winter hat. It shows someone masked, but she could see facial hair. So, it wasn't even the same man. In the confession video found of Claudio about the Brown shooting, it was implied that this shooting was also intentional, the one of Nuno. However, he gave no indication as to why or how long he had been planning this for, unlike saying that he had been planning for the Brown shooting for a long time. Which he then went on to say that his shooting at Brown was completely botched. He hadn't wanted to do it in an auditorium because people could escape out of the fire exits, and that he called the whole thing incompetent. So, I don't know, perhaps Claudio had a psychotic break and went through with his plan at Brown, but he hadn't actually planned it out thoroughly enough, I guess. He hadn't taken into account all the cameras that surround the building that were following him, picking him up, doing all this surveillance on the building and stalking the place, and then maybe on a whim after this decided to go and shoot an old classmate that he was jealous of his success for. It's possible, very possible. But maybe in those 2 days that he went missing after the Brown shooting, where police couldn't find him, maybe he was awaiting instructions. There's a theory that maybe he was part of MK Ultra or something along those lines. Maybe a hired hitman. Who knows? But either way, Nuno Loureiro's death was shocking, and Portugal's president, Marcelo Rebelo de Sousa, describes his death as an irreplaceable loss for science. The next man to sadly lose his life is 67-year-old Carl Grimmer. years later. 29-year-old Freddie Snyder was charged with the murder on February 18th and was separately charged of carjacking and burglary. Snyder lived 2 miles from Carl's house and was reported as having a history of trespassing on Carl's property. And Carl had actually reported him to the police on December 20th, 2025, where Snyder was arrested on a weapons charge in that case, but released 3 days later, which is just crazy to me. Like, if a man's been trespassing on your property multiple times and then he gets caught doing it with a gun, why wasn't there like an immediate restraining order put on him, or I don't know, a tag on his ankle to track his movements or something? Do you know what I mean? Like, surely he's a risk for Carl because he's trespassed multiple times and has a weapon. I don't know, I just feel like something should have been done there. Investigators have yet to uncover a motive, and they found no evidence that Snyder and Grillmere knew each other, other than Snyder trespassing on his property a few times. So was he keeping an eye on Carl for some reason? Or was he just like some crazy guy? That's very possible. But the fact that, again, it's another scientist who's working with finding water on other planets, it all kind of links with space travel, potential other life out in the universe. So the final scientist we're talking about is that of General William Neil McCaslin, who actually went by Neil instead of William, so I'll be calling him Neil throughout this story. Now, I'm just going to run through some of the positions that he's held in his career, not all of them because there are so many, but just to kind of show you how high up and important this man is, especially within special projects, including those that pertain to UFOs and space travel. So, after he graduated from MIT, he was Assistant Director of the Office of Special Projects 13 at Los Angeles Air Force Base, where later on he would become Chief Engineer of the Navstar GPS Joint Program Office, the controlling authority for the global positioning system for government, commercial and consumer applications. And eventually, at the same place in LA, he joined the Space-Based Laser Project Office as Systems Program Director. So, top positions within his field. He then moved to Kirtland Air Force Base, New Mexico, to begin a 3-year stint as Materiel Wing Director, where several of his postings involved close work with the National Reconnaissance Office. In 2007, he was assigned to the Pentagon as Director of Space Acquisition within the Office of the Undersecretary of the Air Force. A director at the Pentagon. In 2009, he was promoted to Director of Special Programs within the Pentagon, which means he had a full purview of all of America's most sensitive and secretive knowledge, capabilities, and programs. In May 2011, McCaslin assumed command of the Air Force Research Laboratory at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, and remained here until he retired in October 2013. Now, the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base is supposedly where the remains of the Roswell UFO crash was taken. So, supposedly the remains from that crash were taken to this Air Force Base, and many believe that this is where alien technology may have they shipped it to the laboratory at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. General McCasland was in charge of that exact laboratory up until a couple of years ago. He not only knows what I'm trying to achieve, he assembled my advisory team. He's a very important man. So that's the kind of man we're talking about here, someone who has been involved in top secret operations for many, many years, so who knows the kind of knowledge this man has been privy to. Then, on February 27th, 2026, Neil McCasland goes missing. At first, he's at home in his quiet neighbourhood at the edge of the Cibola National Forest. A repairman sees him at his house at around 10 a.m. Then at 11:10 a.m. his wife leaves to go to a doctor's appointment, and when she returns home at 12:04, her husband is not at home, and there's no note to say where he's gone. He's left behind his prescription glasses, his phone, which had been switched off, and his smartwatch, so again, all personal items left at home. Nothing that could track him was on him. But his wife Susan doesn't panic at first. She just thinks he's probably just gone for a walk because he did that quite often. But when he hadn't returned home 3 hours later, she started to get a bit worried. So she calls the police. When she talks to the dispatcher, she says there is some indication that he might have planned to not be found because he had changed his clothes and appears to be on foot. So no bikes were missing, their cars were still there. She also tells dispatch that he's been dealing with some medical issues and that both of them were seeing the same doctor for anxiety, lack of sleep, and short-term memory problems. But Susan chalked their health issues up to old age, just getting older, things start wearing down. She did mention that Neil had said if his brain and body keeps deteriorating, he didn't want to live like that, but she said that he said this in a very kind of nonchalant, flippant kind of way, not in a serious, I'm going to harm myself kind of way. So she didn't believe that he would actually do anything. It was more like he was just venting about getting old and how he hates it. When the police asked her about any weapons at the home, or that he may have on him, she said that her husband had a gun safe with multiple pistols and rifles, but she couldn't tell if there was anything missing at the moment. But it did turn out that one of his .38 calibers was missing. So the next day, the police put out a silver alert, which is a statewide alert issued when authorities think a missing person might be disorientated or cognitively impaired. And New Mexico state statute doesn't require any kind of formal diagnosis in order to put out a silver alert. So even though he didn't have any dementia diagnosis or anything, they still put it out as a silver alert because she had told him that they had been suffering from anxiety and short-term memory loss. The Bernalillo County Sheriff's Office, again, it's that double L, I don't know if it's Bernalillo or Bernalillo, said that they had surveillance footage from both ends of the street that he lived on and still couldn't confirm which direction he went in. They asked neighbours to check their doorbell camera footage, any dash cams they might own, GoPros, anything that could possibly catch him on camera, but nothing could be found. Horseback teams, 3 types of search dogs, drones, helicopters and neighbourhood volunteers searched the local area as thoroughly as they could. They searched his usual hiking spots, but there was still no trace of Neil. After weeks, all they managed to find was a grey Air Force sweatshirt about a mile east of his house, and even after testing it, they were unable to confirm if it even belonged to Neil. witnesses said that the week before Neil disappeared, he had cycled 60 miles, that he was highly intelligent and capable, and that there was no indication that he was unhappy or wanting to end his life. He was alert and active and still trying to enjoy his life as best you can in your 70s. They said that he hiked and biked the foothills behind his house often and was no stranger to them, that he knew every trail. So from all accounts, this man, even though he was in his 70s and maybe had a bit of anxiety and memory loss, was still in very good health and was very active. So why would he all of a sudden decide to end everything? After his death came out and the internet went wild with reports of yet another missing scientist, his wife Susan did do a post on Facebook that said, "Neil does not have any special knowledge about ET bodies and debris from the Roswell crash stored at Wright-Patterson." Though at this point, with absolutely no sign of him, maybe the best hypothesis is that aliens beamed him up to the mothership. So, even though she's denying there that he had any UFO knowledge, she's also not saying that she thinks he did this to himself. She thinks that he's missing. And to be honest, with what I have come to understand over the years, watching a lot of interviews and documentaries about special projects and the Pentagon and things like the CIA, it seems as if knowledge is very compartmentalized, meaning only a very few small people ever know about a certain thing, even within the same company. So there might only be like 2 people that know something, even though one of their colleagues is maybe just like 1 notch below them in clearance. That makes a massive difference, and so it's possible that Neil's wife was not cleared to know anything that he did. I think there are many people that work in special projects and the CIA and the Pentagon that cannot disclose their job to their wives, to their family, to their best friends. So she might actually have no idea what information he was privy to. So who knows? You know. But it is very suspicious. Again, he's not been found. He's still missing. He's hiked those foothills behind his house multiple times. He's very fit. He left all his personal effects at home, and they searched thoroughly and cannot find him. Very odd. Now there is one more person I'm going to mention, but he's not a scientist, so take this one with a grain of salt. But he was, I guess, like a researcher. He researched many different things, such as extraterrestrials, UFOs, secret black projects, and he interviewed whistleblowers and different scientists and wrote many books. And his name is David Wilcock. And I've actually known about David Wilcock for many, many years. I even bought one of his books, The Synchronicity Key, years ago. And he is admittedly conspiracy minded. He's also a little bit woo-woo, and I don't agree with everything that he says at all, but there were some really interesting, like I said, interviews and scientists that he spoke to and kind of was talking about, you know, people going mysteriously missing and all these kinds of things. He was kind of outing all this stuff from years ago, decades ago. You know, he spoke about secret projects, cover-ups. So, you know, he covered a lot of secretive information. And he had his own YouTube channel, which was quite big at one point, but I think his audience stagnated after a while and he didn't have as big of a presence as he once did. But home, and it was chalked up to him having done this to himself with a gun. But when I went and looked at his YouTube channel after I found out about this, he had done a live stream 3 days earlier where he's talking about all these scientists going missing. And I'm just going to give a little quote as to one of the things he said, which was, "Every day that I have on Earth is a gift and a blessing. And I'm very grateful for that, because frankly, people are disappearing. Scientists are going missing. And now they're saying they're going to investigate this. The president himself is saying they're going to look into this and see if anything is going on. It's a little bit scary, I've got to say. It's a little bit scary. But you guys knew that I might still show up, even though it was last minute and I've had a really rough week." Now, he obviously mentions there about having a rough week, and so people are like, well, it kind of makes sense then that he did this. Maybe he was really struggling mentally, which is possible. However, in this live stream, he also talked about his spiritual beliefs. And he believes, and I'm not saying this is accurate in any way, and I don't agree with this, but he believes that if you do remove yourself from this life, that you don't get to reincarnate. He said, if you lay down your life, you're done, so please don't do that. So he believed that doing that wasn't good for your soul. And I know that he's held that belief for a very long time. This isn't a new thing for him. So it seems odd that he's preaching that and then he goes and does exactly that 3 days later. I don't know, I'm just not buying that explanation. What's also interesting is that in one of his videos from a few years back, he said the following: "We're now dealing with insiders who are very credible, who are being threatened with their lives for coming forward in very aggressive ways. We've had William Tompkins get killed under very suspicious circumstances." Now, I had never heard of William Tompkins before making this video, so I looked him up, and it turns out that he was in the Navy for research work and supposedly some secret projects. And eventually he wrote a book called Selected by Extraterrestrials: My Life in the Top Secret World of UFOs, Think Tanks and Nordic Secretaries. Then 2 years later, he dies, and I couldn't really find out how. There doesn't seem to be any information on his death. So that's potentially another one to add to the list, but I don't know how credible he is in terms of his job and what his credentials are. I have no idea. But that is, as I'm aware, all of the scientists that have gone missing in the past few years that are within similar fields, again, of nuclear power, propulsion, anti-gravity, UFOs. They're all kind of linked into this secret world and have either died mysteriously or disappeared. There may be more that I'm not aware of, but this is a very long video as it is with just these names, but it's something to think about, because I mean, there is a lot of talk recently about disclosure, and it makes me wonder if they're getting rid of people that actually know the truth so that they could feed us like a false story, false information. But that's the conspiracy theory, right? I